Hello and welcome to Property Insurance Claims Fraud Review. My name is Greg Stafford. I'm a multi-line insurance claim adjuster as well as a certified construction project manager. I've worked for insurers, third-party administrators, independent adjusting firms, general contracting construction companies, project management firms, as well as under my own license representing consumers and insurers in the negotiation and settlement of their claims. Today, I'd like to talk to you about asbestos abatement fraud in property claims and why it's such a big deal. It's not only a big deal financially, which is how we often think of the impact of fraud, but asbestos abatement fraud also damages our environment unnecessarily. Let me share with you first a recent statistic from the FBI reports and publications on the financial impact of fraud before we go and discuss further the environmental cost. It states here the total cost of insurance fraud, non-health insurance, is estimated to be more than $40 billion per year. That means insurance fraud costs the average U.S. family between $400 and $700 per year in the form of increased premiums. And what that statistic does not highlight is the fact that the money that is stolen goes from the pockets of insurance companies and consumers like you and me and into the pockets of criminals and criminal organizations. So let's take a look at Rule 1403 of the Air Quality Management District and see what we can use from it to determine what it is we're required to do as insurance adjusters and insurance companies when we have a property claim involving building materials that are contaminated by asbestos. This is Rule 1403, Asbestos Emissions from Demolition Renovation Activities, amended October 5th, 2007. I will put a link to this PDF in the description below. But if we take a look at Section A, Purpose, it states very clearly the purpose of this rule is to specify work practice requirements to limit asbestos emissions from building demolition and renovation activities, including the removal and associated disturbance of asbestos-containing materials, ACM. The requirements for demolition and renovation activities include asbestos surveying, notification, ACM removal procedures and time schedules, ACM handling and cleanup procedures, and storage, disposal, and landfilling requirements for asbestos-containing waste materials, ACWM. All operators are required to maintain records, including waste shipment records, and are required to use appropriate warning labels, signs, and markings. So very clearly here under purpose, it is to specify work practice requirements to limit asbestos emissions from building demolition and renovation activities, which include the removal and associated disturbance of asbestos-containing materials. Section B, Applicability. This rule, in whole or in part, is applicable to owners and operators of any demolition or renovation activity, and the associated disturbance of asbestos-containing material, any asbestos storage facility, or any active waste disposal site. So once again, we see that this rule, 1403, is applicable to owners and operators of any demolition or renovation activity and the associated disturbance of asbestos-containing material. The asbestos-containing material has to be disturbed or damaged in order to pose a health risk, because the damage or disturbance can release the asbestos fibers, which are hazardous to people's health. But if there's no renovation or demolition activity which disturbs the asbestos in, for example, drywall mud, then there's no reason to remove the drywall. It has to be disturbed. Let's take a look at a few other sections of AQMD Rule 1403. If we scroll down to section D, again, I'll put a link to this PDF below so you can review it entirely on your own. Section D, requirements. If we go down further, subsection 1, demolition renovation activities, and then down further to subsection C. I'll just scroll right through it together here. Asbestos removal schedule, page 1403, 11. And then further down to subsection 2, renovations and non-burning demolitions. If you look under subsection 5, so if you have a fire, for example, let's say you have a fire in one room in a house and it destroys all the drywall in that room. All of the asbestos in that drywall is disturbed, or will be when it's removed because it's been damaged due to the fire. But a room on the opposite side of the house that's nowhere near the room that was affected doesn't have any disturbed drywall. And in fact, there are many homes where there won't even be any ventilation in rooms to carry any of the residual soot or released material. But even if, for example, a room that was not destroyed by fire were contaminated either through ventilation or other cross-contamination, people walking through, they're not supposed to, and drywall material from the destroyed or damaged rooms ends up in undamaged rooms and is now on the floor or on the walls. Well, that can be cleaned without disturbing the drywall. Cleaning drywall or cleaning flooring does not disturb asbestos in the drywall mud or in the flooring mastic, for example. If you had to clean the surface of a flooring, that's not going to disturb asbestos that's encapsulated in mastic, for example. So there has to be a disturbance of the asbestos in the asbestos-containing materials, either from the fire directly in this example, or if there's contamination, it's not usually going to cause disturbance of asbestos-containing building materials, but you might have contents, hard and soft contents, that can become contaminated with asbestos-containing materials from other areas of the house. Most people know that hard surface items can be cleaned. There are a few dishonest public adjusters and others that they'll claim everything. They'll claim anything, even undamaged drywall, or completely sealed up contents in containers, in rooms that were not even affected. I've seen it all. So don't be surprised. But generally, most people are not that dishonest. And so they'll put down to clean hard surface furniture items if they've just been covered with asbestos contaminated material. And they'll often total loss verified contaminated soft goods. But often the question is what's actually been contaminated. When an asbestos consultant is hired, for example, they'll prepare a report, a survey, that will either assume that materials are contaminated or they'll do a sampling. They're allowed to do either one. They're not allowed to declare that unsampled materials are not contaminated. So they will generally presume or assume that all items or materials in a house, even in areas that are not directly affected, for example, by a fire, are contaminated, or they will sample because they don't want to claim they're not contaminated and then later on they find out they are. So as an insurer or an adjuster, you're not required to accept an asbestos consultant's presumption or assumption that all items in a house are contaminated. And again, if they're hard surface items, even if they are contaminated, they're usually cleanable. But if a declaration is made in a survey that all soft goods are contaminated, then as an adjuster or insurer, you have the option of having that consultant sample the areas you do not believe were affected by the loss. And then the consultant will sample them and determine, versus assume or presume, whether or not they actually are contaminated. And so there are many cases where the asbestos is in another area of the house, and other rooms in the house are unaffected or lightly affected. And often the claim will be exaggerated, not just claiming that building materials with asbestos and undisturbed asbestos need to be torn out when they don't, and often even include hard surface items. I've seen hard surface items in containers and in dressers, in rooms barely affected, included as total loss. But all of the soft goods will be included unless you sample them most often, because either the consultant will want to assume or presume they're contaminated and not accept the liability, or the public adjuster or those involved in the fraud will try to collect everything in terms of total loss money as part of the loss. If you don't sample the soft good items you don't believe were actually affected by the claim. If they were affected and they can't be cleaned, nobody has a problem with total lossing those items if they're covered. The problem is when we're asked to total loss items that either aren't total loss, can be cleaned, won't disturb the asbestos, or haven't been sampled. They've just been assumed to be contaminated because a room in another part of the house was affected. So each claim will be a little bit different, but these are the procedures you can use to determine if there's actually going to be any disturbance to the asbestos-containing building materials, and then whether or not any of the soft goods have actually even been contaminated. So it's not really even a question at first as to whether or not soft goods can be cleaned. They're often not even contaminated if they're far removed from the area of the loss. All right, let's take a look at a few more sections of the Rule 1403. So if we look at this section here, so with that in mind, it states if for any reason, so if in our example you have the fire, one room has been destroyed by fire, drywall's damaged, there's no question it's been disturbed, that area is under containment, it's now undergoing a renovation, the asbestos is being abated in preparation for the repairs. Section D, 1C, 2, V, or 5. If for any reason any renovation or demolition results in an associated disturbance of asbestos-containing material or Class 2 non-friable asbestos-containing material outside of a containment or work area, then prior to continuing with any renovation or demolition activity, the owner-operator shall secure, stabilize, and survey the affected facility areas and submit and obtain an approved Procedure 5 plan prior to any asbestos cleanup. Notice once again, if this is dealing with the scenario where we already have a room that's been contained because the asbestos has been disturbed, and so if any renovation or demolition results in an associated disturbance outside of a containment or work area, there's already a contained area, it's being abated as part of the renovation, and then there's a disturbance during that renovation abatement work in another area of the house where it hadn't been disturbed previously. That's what this section is addressing. But notice it states clearly once again that we're dealing with renovation or demolition activities which result in an associated disturbance. It's not talking about drywall that can just be cleaned or wiped down with no disturbance of the asbestos-containing material. And so let's take a look now at some questions that are answered by AQMD regarding its Rule 1403. I'll put a link to this PDF below. It's updated December 7th, 2018. Let's take a look at section 3.11. Is a survey required? Do I need a survey to have an asbestos? Do I need to have an asbestos survey prior to any demolition or renovation? Yes. An asbestos survey report is signed by an asbestos consultant, as defined in the rule, is required prior to any demolition or renovation. So once again, we're having a demolition or renovation activity that disturbs asbestos. Where it concerns property insurance claims, we're talking about the damage that results from the claim. We're not talking about desires of a property owner for work that isn't related to the claim. A homeowner, a property owner, can contract to have asbestos building materials removed anytime they want, according to the proper regulations and procedures. But when we're talking property insurance claims, there has to be damage due to the claim for coverage to exist. Let's take a look further down at section 3.13. Who can conduct a survey? And we'll skip down just a couple questions here. Can a certified site surveillance technician, CSST, make the determination of asbestos content and condition, or presume or assume ACM? Yes, the certified site surveillance technician, CSST, is trained to be able to identify homogeneous suspect materials and can presume or assume a material is asbestos-containing material, ACM, subject to Rule 1403. So this is very important for you insurers and insurance adjusters because it underscores what I stated earlier, that the asbestos consultant that prepares the initial survey that abatement contractors and estimators will use regarding the asbestos-containing materials that need to be removed due to the claim, the asbestos consultant can either assume or presume or sample suspect areas, but they cannot declare them non-contaminated without sampling. So it's critical for insurers and adjusters to recognize when an asbestos consultant is assuming or presuming, especially for soft goods, asbestos contamination. Because while you can clean surfaces and flooring that are just contaminated without being directly affected, for example, by the fire, but they've had some asbestos particulate matter cross-contaminated through the room that wasn't affected, as I mentioned before. While that can be cleaned, hard surfaces can be cleaned, soft goods are really a questionable area. And so rather than get into the dispute over what can be cleaned if it's actually contaminated by asbestos, we first need to verify by sampling, especially if we're talking about soft goods in rooms far removed from the directly affected area. In unventilated rooms, there's no HVAC ventilation system carrying contaminated air into the room. And where there are clothes in dresser drawers or closets. These are not likely areas of a house, according to the claim scenario we're using, that would in any way be affected by asbestos-containing materials. And so the assumption or presumption that is pretty standard for asbestos consultants, unless they actually sample those areas, is going to stand unless you actually examine the photos, the rooms, you do an inspection, and you identify items in rooms where the consultant has assumed or presumed what they're allowed to assume or presume. Even if they're incorrect, they're allowed to do that. If you don't ask them to sample or have someone else sample the materials they're assuming or presuming are contaminated, soft goods in particular, if you don't have it sampled, then their assumption or presumption is likely going to stand and you're going to end up overpaying a claim. And the public adjuster and insureds who are involved in the fraud, asbestos abatement fraud in these instances, they know when you pay for all of the soft goods in a house to be total loss, just because an asbestos consultant has assumed or presumed that they're contaminated, they know that those items in many cases either weren't affected or can be cleaned. And so you just end up paying them. They end up keeping the property, and it's a double take. They get to keep all their property, and you're paying them for replacing it. At least actual cash value in most cases. So, and you have that fraud going on with the soft goods. That is the attempt to link them up with the assumption or presumption in the asbestos consultant survey that's not based on an actual sampling, but that they're allowed to do. Have to check that carefully. Hard surface items, again, in building materials, that's different. They're not as questionable in terms of being cleanable. Although you may still find on both public adjusters and asbestos consultant surveys items and materials that are not directly affected by the claim. So keeping these things in mind, you can recognize situations involving fraud where there's either a asbestos consultant report that is clearly assuming or presuming things, especially for any hard surface items or building materials that aren't disturbed, that are not warranted due to the loss. Or even where they're assuming or presuming things on soft goods, I recommend you do sampling in areas that are not directly affected by the claim and or likely contaminated due to the loss. Let's take a look further at other questions and answers, as many of these directly relate to the type of fraud that we're talking about. Going further, if we look at another question right below that's asked, it says, can a facility owner treat suspect asbestos-containing material as asbestos-containing material and follow Rule 1403 requirements without hiring a CAC or CSST asbestos consultant for surveying the facility? Notice the response. All materials that may be disturbed during a renovation or demolition must be surveyed for the presence of asbestos and asbestos condition by a certified asbestos consultant or certified site surveillance technician prior to any demolition or renovation activity. Once again, it states clearly that the materials that are in view are those that may be disturbed. Actual damaged material. For example, drywall in a room where a fire occurred. It's likely disturbed. But in a room on the opposite side of the house where that fire occurred, unless the fire reached close to that area, it's not disturbed. It's not to be included in the scope of work involved in the renovation or demolition. Let's go even further down to section 3.23. We'll scroll just a little bit further here, and you can look at all these completely on your own. I'll put a link to this PDF in the description. A lot of great information here, but I'm just highlighting several items so that you understand essentially what's at issue here. At what point do we include asbestos in a claim where there is material that actually has asbestos in it? Okay, so the building materials have asbestos in it. Is the asbestos disturbed? If the answer is no, it's not to be included in the claim. Section 3.2.3, Rule 1403, Notification, Web Application. Let's take a look here. This is the same answer that you're going to see as well in Section 3.4, Asbestos Disposal. And then it says, here's the question we'll take a look at. Does the SCA QMD, when processing a notification, the system already generates it as friable, and there's no option to choose non-friable? We dispose of the waste as non-friable. Is this something we can get cited for? Will you be able to add drywall non-friable to the notification? It's an interesting answer that applies in several respects to what we're discussing in this video. And so here's what it says. For the purposes of notification that the material will be removed during a renovation, drywall is considered friable because it cannot be removed as a unit. And so that's why there was some confusion on the part of the questioner, because there's drywall, like we've been discussing, in areas of a house, for example, affected by fire, that may not be damaged, but they may be removing it anyway as part of the renovation. Maybe they're dealing with a renovation that's not a claim renovation, and the homeowner wants them to tear out the drywall in an undamaged room. And so they're saying that the system is having them classify the undamaged drywall as friable or pulverizable, powderable. It's more easy to release the asbestos fibers when it's in that condition versus non-friable. And the response states that the reason why it's always considered friable is because you have to cut it out. You can't remove it as a unit. And so as it states in the last sentence, it has to be torn out to be removed. And that makes the material friable, powderable, pulverizable, crushable in your hand when it's dry, so that the asbestos fibers are more easily released, no longer bonded. Again, this section and this answer to this question refers to material removed during a renovation and that is torn out to be removed. So if it's just someone who wants to tear out a room because they're doing a renovation, well, they're allowed to do that. But in a property insurance claim, the only damages that are covered when it comes to asbestos abatement of building materials that are contaminated is if that asbestos material is disturbed. All right, let's take a look at one or two further sections. Let's go down to section 3.5, emergency situations. General procedures, section 3.5.1. It states, or the question is, having to prepare and file paperwork for a Procedure 5 notification to submit the SCA QMD delays a cleanup in emergency situations. So they're saying during an emergency, when something happens suddenly, they don't have time to get the paperwork prepared to file what's called the Procedure 5 survey. And so they ask further, OSHA requires that a cleanup occurs as soon as possible. How does the SCA QMD address the conflict? Okay, so there's an emergency situation. There has to be a cleanup done right away, but we don't have time to file the required paperwork or notification. And so here's the answer from AQMD. According to Robert Olson, Associate Safety Engineer, Cal OSHA, asbestos and carcinogen control units, quote, in the case of a spill or other uncontrolled release of asbestos fibers, what Cal OSHA requires ASAP is that a regulated area be established, access limited to those persons cleaning up the spilled debris, and effective measures that prevent migration of asbestos fibers out of the regulated area and into the adjacent areas where employees may be exposed. This is similar to what is referred to in Rule 1403 as secure and stabilized. We read that earlier. So here it's very clear that in an emergency situation, uncontrolled release of asbestos fibers, what's required ASAP is that a regulated area be established. Okay, so if you have a fire, that's an emergency. A room is on fire, burns, the fire's put out. Now you've got this disturbed asbestos, for example, in the drywall we've been using in our example. A regulated area has to be established. Access has to be limited to those persons cleaning up the spill and debris. And effective measures that prevent migration of asbestos fibers out of the regulated area. So in our example, if you have a fire and the room that is disturbed is contained because the asbestos has been released, it's been disturbed, the requirements, according to Associate Safety Engineer Cal OSHA that was quoted here, Robert Olson, in the AQMD Q&A PDF that I'm linking in the description below, measures have to be taken to prevent the migration of asbestos fibers from the contained area where the asbestos has been disturbed. I've had claims where not only is the claim reported late and the insurer, the adjuster, we don't even have time to be there during when the claim originally occurred to be able to provide input. But I've had claims where containment is completed, thousands of dollars are paid to contain the area that was directly affected. And then I've had public adjusters go into the property and directly migrate debris from the contaminated areas throughout the house, and then claim that property throughout the house that wasn't damaged by the claim, but that got contaminated because of their migration of the asbestos fibers by not following these measures. I've had them claim that as part of the loss, even though they're the ones who either didn't direct for the proper regulated area to be established and access limited, so this migration didn't occur. I've had them actually claim they were the ones who migrated the fibers, and therefore the insurance company has to pay. So when it comes to asbestos abatement fraud, anything is possible. And I recommend that you stay as close to this information as possible so that you can cite the appropriate regulations, rules, answers to specific questions, some of which may directly relate to your claim. It'll make it easier to blunt the fraudulent claim by simply pointing out the facts of what is required and what is not, what's disturbed and what is not, what's covered by the policy and what is not. Let's take a look at a few other things, though, from the AQMD question and answers. There's another question and answer right below, or fairly soon below. Several questions, in fact, under this section. 3.52 hazardous scenarios that will often directly relate to the types of claims we have in property insurance. So here are several questions. My house is on fire. Do I need to submit a notification before the fire department arrives to put out the fire? A pipe burst. A pipe has burst in the wall and water is flooding throughout my house. Do I need to submit a notification before the plumber opens the wall to repair the pipe? We have discovered an underground pipe that is leaking. Do we need to submit a notification prior to addressing the leak? Answer: no. No notification is required prior to addressing a hazardous situation that is currently happening. Once the immediate hazard has been addressed, the site must be secured. Any abatement contractor should know this. Any public adjuster licensed, at least in the state of California, who has worked with any credible abatement contractor and who comes across a fire loss where there's not a secure, stabilized location at the site should immediately move for that to occur, and for a survey of the presence and condition of asbestos containing and asbestos contaminating materials. You don't migrate asbestos throughout the property from the secured area of containment, the directly affected area. If asbestos containing materials have been disturbed or damaged as a result of or as part of the response to the hazardous situation, a Procedure 5 approved alternative cleanup plan must be submitted and approved prior to asbestos cleanup. Once again, if asbestos containing materials have been disturbed or damaged as a result of or as part of the response to the situation, in this case, a fire loss. In our example, if there's been no disturbance of the asbestos-containing materials, building materials, they don't need to be removed, nor should they be included in any scope of repair due to the claim. Let's take a look at the question directly below. An unintentional fire happens. Okay, so this is almost directly parallel to the example we've been using. And it leaves parts of the building, for example, a wall, part of the roof intact. When do you have to treat the remaining structures as asbestos-containing material? When you knock down a remaining wall, is that a demolition? Okay, so we have two questions here. The first question is very similar because we've been discussing Essentially, in our scenario, a claim where a fire occurs in one room and there's no damage to other areas of the house that are not directly near the origin of the fire room. So what do you do if there's no, we've already seen very clearly that if there's no renovation or demolition going to take place in the undamaged room, and there's no disturbance to the asbestos containing materials, they don't need to be removed. But let's look at how the answer is worded to this specific question, since it's very similar to the example we've been using. When the site is to be addressed, it must be inspected by a certified asbestos consultant or certified site surveillance technician. All materials must be assessed and their asbestos content determined in accordance with Rule 1403 and NESHAP. If asbestos containing materials have been disturbed, then the CAC who prepares the survey report would recommend a Procedure 4 or Procedure 5 cleanup, which must be reviewed and approved by the SCA QMD. If no ACM or asbestos containing waste material is found during the survey or after the ACM and ACWM is abated, a demolition notification is required if one or more load-bearing members will be wrecked or removed. Okay, but notice the key part here, right here. If asbestos containing materials have been disturbed, consistent with everything we've read from AQMD 1403 and AQMD's answers to questions to this point. Now let's take a look at another publication. This one from the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency. Protect your family from exposures to asbestos. We'll take a look at the second highlight key. I'll put a link again in the description below. You can take a look at this on your own. These are great resources. I highly recommend them. What to do if you have asbestos in your home. Okay, so what's the understanding that the EPA would like people to have as far as asbestos containing materials are concerned? We've read clearly now in several instances of the AQMD Rule 1403 and AQMD's answers to questions about Rule 1403. And all of them very clearly stated that building materials with asbestos in them only need to be removed if the asbestos containing materials are actually disturbed. Yet we have claims being made by public adjusters, by abatement contractors, that include building materials that are not disturbed. They've not even been affected, nor will they be affected. And yet they want to claim them as part of the loss, fraudulently steal money from the insurance company and from you and I in the form of increased premiums, and then further destroy our environment unnecessarily. Let's take a look at what the EPA has to say about asbestos in your home. I'll take the full view here so you can see it better. What to do if you have asbestos in your home. If you think there may be asbestos in your home, don't panic. Asbestos containing materials that aren't damaged or disturbed are not likely to pose a health risk. Usually the best thing is to leave asbestos containing material alone if it's in good condition. So that would be consistent with the references we read earlier from the AQMD sources, that if it's not disturbed, it doesn't need to be removed or wouldn't be undergoing a renovation or demolition, at least not in an insurance claim. A homeowner can still, of course, remove and replace whatever they want. Generally, asbestos containing material that is in good condition and will not be disturbed by remodeling, for example, will not release asbestos fibers. Asbestos containing materials may release fibers when they are disturbed, damaged, removed improperly, repaired, cut, torn, sanded, sawed, drilled, or scraped. Keep an eye on asbestos containing materials and visually check them over time for signs of wear or damage. If you suspect material contains asbestos, don't touch it. Look for signs of wear or damage such as tears, abrasions, or water damage. Damaged material may release asbestos fibers. This is particularly true if you often disturb it by hitting, rubbing, or handling, or if it is exposed to extreme vibration or airflow. For slightly damaged asbestos-containing material, sometimes the best way to deal with it is to limit access to the area and not to touch or disturb it. If asbestos-containing material is more than slightly damaged, or if you are going to make changes in your home that might disturb it, repair or removal by a trained and accredited asbestos professional is needed. And let's just take a quick look at a couple of these asbestos do's and don'ts. Do leave undamaged asbestos-containing materials alone. This is directly contradictory to what many public adjusters and abatement contractors are currently advocating in their estimates for asbestos-containing materials. They are including in these claims the removal of undamaged materials. Second asbestos do and don't. Do keep activities to a minimum in any areas having damaged material that may contain asbestos, including limiting children's access to any materials that may contain asbestos. Do take every precaution to avoid damaging asbestos-containing material. Do have removal and major repair done by people trained and qualified in handling asbestos. And then it gives some other asbestos do's and don'ts. The final one of which is don't track material that could contain asbestos through the house. If you have a room that's been affected, again, secure and stabilize the area so that it can be contained, properly abated, and sectioned off from other areas of the property that have not been disturbed. If you cannot avoid walking through the area, have it cleaned with a wet mop. If the material is from a damaged area, or if a large area must be cleaned, call an asbestos professional. So that's good advice from the EPA. It's consistent with what we read in the AQMD sources. And again, it specifically states to leave undamaged asbestos-containing materials alone. Now let's take a look at the Contractor State License Board, California, Department of Consumer Affairs, The Consumer's Guide to Asbestos. I'll put a link to this publication below as well. Let's go down to page, we'll go down to page 7. It's from 2013. Very handy publication with a lot of useful material, but I'm just going to share information from 2 pages that specifically pertains to the subject that we're discussing. So it notes here in 1977, the Federal Consumer Product Safety Commission banned patching compounds that contain asbestos. Some wall and ceiling joints may be patched with asbestos-containing material manufactured before 1977. If the material is in good condition, it is best to leave it alone. Sanding and scraping will release asbestos fibers. If it is in poor condition, or if the wall or ceiling needs to be removed or repaired, follow the guidelines on page 13. All right, let's go down to page 13. And here we have general guidelines for handling products containing asbestos. And we'll just take a look at a couple of them here. Asbestos is a known cancer-causing agent and should only be removed by a registered asbestos abatement contractor. Follow these basic precautions when working with asbestos. Do not disturb any material you think may contain asbestos unless you have to. Removal of the material is usually the last alternative. Seal off the work area from the rest of the building. You may use plastic sheeting and duct tape. Take great care not to track asbestos dust into other areas of the residence. So again, these facts, requirements, and positions are unequivocal. They're clear. If there is asbestos in building materials that is disturbed, then it should be removed. If a homeowner desires to remove asbestos-containing materials, it can be removed. Insurance claims cover damage that is the result of a sudden and accidental loss. If it's covered under the policy, then the asbestos-containing materials, in order for the removal cost to be covered under the policy, must be damaged or disturbed as a result of the claim. If they're not, then they shouldn't be a part of any abatement estimate. They shouldn't be included in any asbestos consultant's survey or report. And they certainly shouldn't be paid by an insurance company so that it encourages the continuation of this type of fraud, where undisturbed asbestos-containing building materials are being included in property claims made by public adjusters and abatement contractors for insureds in order to get more money from the insurance company than it is warranted due to the loss. If we don't start taking a closer look at the claims being made and the reports that are coming with these claims, we're going to continue to fund these criminals and criminal operations that have become dependent at this point on this type of fraud for their very existence. We're going to need to take a closer look not only at claims that are made and the reports provided by these asbestos consultants, but we need to start taking a closer look at the containment procedures that are being done or not done by the public adjuster or the abatement contractor or the general contractor or whomever the insured is relying on after a loss occurs prior to contacting their insurer. So if a public adjuster is there before the insurance company and fails to direct the insured properly where it concerns the containment of a loss area with suspect contaminated building materials, they could be liable for damages that result either from that public adjuster's migration of asbestos fibers throughout the property that is now affected not because of the loss, but because of the actions of persons who should know better. If we start taking a closer look at some of these claims and some of these reports that are coming with these that are coming in as part of this asbestos abatement fraud, we'll be able to get a better handle on the claim sooner so that we make it clearer to all parties involved what is and is not covered. Because the longer it takes for you as the insurer or me as the adjuster to provide a clear position on what it is we're covering and what it is we're not, then the corrupt public adjuster, insured, abatement, or other contractor are going to take advantage of that. They're going to make outrageous claims of contamination or that undisturbed building materials need to be included as part of the loss that are going to really not only rob you of potential finances included with the fraud, but of your time and of your ability to service other claims and insureds who aren't committing fraud.